What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Saul, Canelo Alvarez, 56 wins, 1 loss, and 2 draws, defending his WBA, WBC, and WBO, as well as the ring, 168-pound super middleweight titles against Caleb Plant, 21 wins, 0 losses, who will be defending his IBF 168-pound title. This is the battle for undisputed champion at super middleweight. Now, do you remember, and it was less than only a year ago, when Canelo Alvarez was embattled with Golden Boy, and it looked like, okay, it's already a pandemic year, 2020. We're not getting the fights that we really want. I mean, boxing had completely shut down for a few months, started to come back in the summer. We did get Teofimo Lopez versus Lomachenko, or should I say Lomachenko versus Teofimo Lopez, as well as a few other good fights, but that one was super high magnitude. But it was looking like, damn, one of the most exciting and legendary careers currently in the sport looks like it's going to be put on a hiatus indefinitely until Canelo and Golden Boy and DAZN get this whole thing worked out. It was looking really bleak in terms of Canelo's immediate future. Again, this was less than a year ago, and then all of a sudden they just worked it out, and on short notice, with a temporary partnership between Canelo and Matchroom and Eddie Hearn, they put together Canelo versus the then WBA champion, 168, Callum Smith, on relatively short notice. They're basically saying, yeah, in December, Canelo versus Callum Smith is going down. And anybody who was paying attention to the situation is like, really? I mean, damn. And then Canelo performed in the way where he did just dominate the WBA champ, Callum Smith. And by the way, the WBC was also up for grabs as a vacant title for that Canelo versus Callum Smith fight, because David Benavidez had just lost his WBC belt for the second time, but this time he lost it on the scale right before fighting Romer Angulo. So 2 belts were on the line for this fight, and Canelo Alvarez just dominated Callum Smith in a fight that, in hindsight, we could say, oh yeah, Callum Smith never had a chance. Well, leading up to the fight, I thought that that was going to be a very competitive matchup. I thought that that was a pretty scary opponent for Canelo. Now, you could dissect things and say, well, he wasn't very quick. Who did he really fight besides like an old George Groves and Rocky Fielding? I mean, we could pick apart Callum Smith all we want, but again, going into the fight, you just have to take one look at the odds at the time to say, yes, that was supposed to be a very competitive fight. Canelo Alvarez dominated. And since then, he's had 2 fights in 2021, and this will be his 3rd fight in 2021. He was trying to go for 4 fights, but things just didn't work out in a timeline that would allow for 4 fights in 2021. But basically, within a calendar year, you will have gotten 4 fights from Canelo Alvarez when we had just thought we might not see him at all in 2021. So, as a boxing fan, I just want to say I'm pretty thankful that he has really been this active since that breaking away from Golden Boy Promotions. Now, Canelo is kind of at a point of his career. When you look at his body of work, he is kind of entering those stages of the legends where you can look at their careers, especially the legends who had a ton of fights. I mean, other legends like Sugar Ray Leonard didn't have so many fights. So people would be surprised at how few fights Sugar Ray Leonard had throughout his entire career, because he started doing the part-time retirement thing fairly early. But you look at the age that Canelo Alvarez turned pro, like before he was 18 years old, and he had worked up a whole bunch of fights before people even really saw him on a greater scale on that Shane Mosley versus Sergio Mora undercard, where Canelo Alvarez knocked Carlos Baldemir, former champion, knocked his lights out. And since then, he has developed a legendary resume. But Canelo Alvarez has been around for so long, not so much based on the years, but more so based on the activity, that understand that even though Canelo Alvarez isn't that old age-wise, I mean, he's only 31 years old, but because of his activity, I don't expect him to age into his mid-30s and into his late 30s into 40 the way that some fighters are able to. I think he's actually going to age out just a little bit sooner because, I mean, he's gone 12 rounds twice with Triple G. Which, by the way, can we acknowledge that that crossroads for both fighters is just one of those things where, you know, I thought that Triple G deserved to win the first fight, and I thought that the second one could have gone either way or a draw. That's how I saw those two fights. But just in terms of what they did to those two fighters' career trajectories, it was almost like Sugar Ray Leonard and Marvelous Marvin Hagler, where because of the way the judges ruled, the legacy and the narratives and the stories that are told kind of have the two fighters diverging like this because of the results of the judging. Like, could you imagine where Triple G's legacy would stand if he had been rewarded the W in the first fight? Or if not the first fight, say they did rule it a draw, which they did, but if he was rewarded with a victory in the second fight, what their career trajectories would have looked like, even though Canelo Alvarez was the much younger fighter. It just seems crushing to Triple G's legacy that he had the unfortunate end of the stick in both cases, because you could argue that even that draw in the first fight was a total disservice to Triple G. Well, Canelo Alvarez being rewarded the win in the second fight basically captured all the spoils of victory, and that just sent him on a launch pad where if you were to just dial it a few years prior when he was like just flirting with 160 against a much smaller 160 Miguel Cotto, because Cotto was never a true 160 guy, even though he beat Daniel Gill for a share of the title. I mean, Cotto wasn't even really a 154 guy. He was truly 140, 147. But if you were to tell me, you know, around the time that Canelo was fighting Erislandy Lara or James Kirkland, Alfredo Angulo, or Miguel Cotto, which, by the way, were the 4 fights just after he fought Floyd Mayweather, earning him his only loss to date. If you were to tell me that Canelo Alvarez was going to grow into the legend that he has become, I just would have never believed you. I mean, even if you were to say that he was going to hold his own, like at 160, I would have been like, all right, but he's not going to be Triple G. And he certainly isn't going to end up being a monster at 168. I mean, the guy's only like 5'8". You got to be kidding me. Well, look at what we've seen now after his 2 fights, very grueling fights with Triple G. Which, by the way, even if you didn't think that he won either of those 2 fights versus Triple G, which I don't, the level to which he exceeded my expectations against Triple G is enough for me to totally tip my cap and say, yo, I didn't see that coming. I didn't see you fighting 24 rounds with Triple G without tasting the canvas once and fighting that competitively and high-spirited in both fights, especially the way that he fought that second fight. But here we are, and after the Triple G fight, you know, he goes up and beats kind of a lesser, you know, a paper champ at 168 and Rocky Fielding. Then it's like, okay, well, he flirted with 168, but that's clearly not going to be Canelo Alvarez's weight class, right? So then he comes back to 160, and then he fights Daniel Jacobs, and he decision wins against Jacobs, where it's like, damn, man, because I thought that might be a 50-50-ish fight. Daniel Jacobs was a super high-quality opponent. And then after Jacobs, then he goes up to 175, flirts with light heavyweight, knocks Sergey Kovalev, the former Crusher, out, and then he takes that hiatus where it looks like, again, we think that his career is on ice. And then before you know it, he's in the ring with Callum Smith, and then Avni Yildirim, and then Billy Joe Saunders. And in doing so, capturing 3 of the 4 titles at 168. And by the way, his fight versus Avni Yildirim, a lot of people could say, well, who is that bum? Well, look, Avni Yildirim fought a super competitive fight versus 2-time former 168-pound champ Anthony Durrell, brother of Andre Durrell. So Avni Yildirim isn't a bad fighter by any stretch. Canelo Alvarez was just so damn good that they were just leagues apart from each other. So Avni Yildirim looked like he didn't belong in the ring with Canelo. So that just tells you how damn good Canelo Alvarez really is. So look, the question heading into this one is, does Caleb Plant really stand a chance at beating Canelo Alvarez? Well, look, Caleb Plant is a very good fighter. He won the title, the IBF belt, against Jose Uzcategui, who had won the belt after fighting Andre Durrell twice. First fight, he was disqualified by hitting Andre Durrell out cold, knocking him out cold just after the bell sounded, which he then got assaulted by Andre Durrell's corner, like totally sucker punch. I mean, arrests were made. But then in the rematch between Dirrell and Uskadagai, and keep in mind, this is Andre Dirrell, not his brother Anthony Dirrell, the former two-time champ that I just mentioned. But in that rematch between Uskadagai and Dirrell, Uskadagai just totally outclassed Dirrell to where it was like, hey, Andre Dirrell, maybe it's time to retire because he looked pretty bad in that rematch. Well, when Caleb Plant got the opportunity to fight Jose Uskadagai, he won just about every round. He dropped him twice, even though the first of those two knockdowns could have been kind of a slip-ish. The second knockdown wasn't a slip, and Caleb Plant pretty much dominated Uskadagai and captured the IBF belt. And he has now defended that belt 3 times. But if you look at the guys who he defended it against, it was Mike Lee, Vince Feigenbutz, and then most recently, Caleb Truax, who is a pretty good fighter and who did upset James DeGale and fought him very competitively in the rematch. But Caleb Truax was about like 40 years old. So we've got Caleb Plant in his prime fighting a near 40 years old Caleb Truax. And it wasn't an explosive fight. It wasn't Caleb Plant's most impressive showing. But he did win just about every round in a lackluster fight. But that was his 3rd title defense. And he did knock Mike Lee and Vince Feigenbutz out in defense of his titles or title just before that. So 3 successful title defenses against less than elite competition. Hell, less than elite competition. Like if you look at like Mike Lee and Vince Feigenbutz, like what the hell are they doing fighting for any title? But that's a whole other conversation about how boxing and its sanctioning bodies work. Well, it is what it is. He did make his mandatory defenses against them. But does he stand a chance at beating Canelo Alvarez? And if so, why is it? What does he bring to the table that, Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, Sergey Kovalev, Gennady Golovkin didn't bring to the table? Even though, again, you could argue that Gennady Golovkin won one or both of those fights against Canelo. Another discussion for another day. Well, Caleb Plant is a sweet science type boxer. He's got quick hands, he's got good defense, good movement, good ring generalship. He's a great round winner, among the best, pound for pound, in my opinion, round winners. You have certain guys who will put your lights out. You've got great round winners, and then you got guys who could do both effectively. Well, it's hard to win rounds against Caleb Plant. He uses his movement. He's got a higher boxing IQ than all of his opponents to date. And he's a pretty underrated athlete. He's tough as nails. Like you see his demeanor and how he carries himself. He's got supreme confidence. He doesn't take no mess from anybody. He's from Tennessee. But athletically, I mean, just look at the guy's build and look at some of the workouts and some of the impressive things that he could do to demonstrate and showcase his athleticism. He does things that regular people just can't do. But is that enough to match wits with Canelo Alvarez in this battle for Undisputed? Well, I would then ask the question, which of Canelo's opponents to date does Caleb Plant most closely resemble? And I was thinking, like, it's not 5'7" Floyd Mayweather. He's not any of these guys that, Canelo has fought at 168. Not Callum Smith, not Avni Yildirim, Rocky Fielding. Maybe Billy Joe Saunders-ish, but no. Billy Joe Saunders is a slick southpaw who uses a lot of movement and, probably has better movement than Caleb Plant. Maybe even better defense than Caleb Plant. But, Billy Joe Saunders isn't a true 168 guy. I get it. He's a champion or a former champion now at 168, and he's won a few fights at 168. But you look at his build, he's more of a 160 guy who just went up to 168. But he's not as big as Caleb Plant. Caleb Plant is a true 6'1", whereas Billy Joe Saunders is what, like 5'10", 5'11"? Listed at 5'11", so he's a couple inches shorter than Caleb Plant. And again, he's not as physically strong as Caleb Plant. Hand speed wise, I would say that they're pretty close. I think Billy Joe Saunders perhaps throws more combinations, doesn't hit as hard as Caleb Plant by any stretch, so it's not apples to apples here. But I do think that there's certain things that Billy Joe Saunders does and did against Canelo Alvarez that will frustrate him and frustrated Canelo. Some people think that it wasn't a competitive fight. I, scoring it round by round, found it a lot more competitive than most people I saw feedback-wise. But Billy Joe Saunders could do certain things, in terms of his level of trickery that I haven't seen yet in Caleb Plant's game. So again, it's not apples to apples. Maybe Daniel Jacobs is the closest, especially out of recent opponents, which is pretty much what you want. You want to only look at 160 and 168 here because he's not fighting 154 and Arislandi Lara. But Daniel Jacobs, a true 6-footer, good technical boxer, orthodox, pretty good defender, good movement, just a pretty good sweet science guy, has some pop in his hands. But you know what? With Daniel Jacobs, I kind of feel like he peaked around the time he fought Peter Quillen, Kid Chocolate, when he knocked him out. Pretty shockingly. This was supposed to be a high-stakes fight, and Daniel Jacobs knocked out Peter Quillen, giving him his first loss, and Peter Quillen's really never been the same since. But, you know, after that fight, Daniel Jacobs lost a very close and spirited decision loss against Triple G. But by the time Jacobs fought Canelo, I thought maybe something was missing, or maybe something was diminished in Daniel Jacobs still sweating all the way down to 160 when it had pretty much become apparent that, you've pretty much outgrown this division by now. But just in terms of their skill sets, I think Caleb Plant more closely resembles Daniel Jacobs than other Canelo Alvarez opponents. Is Caleb Plant and his skill set enough, though, to win a fight against Canelo Alvarez? You've got to lean no, right? I mean, even in their face-off, when they had the chance to just do a quick little slap box exchange, when Canelo Alvarez just shoved Caleb Plant, hard push too, and Caleb Plant comes, should have taken his glasses off, but then comes up and walks up to Canelo, makes contact, Canelo rolls, throws a right hand, and by the way, Caleb Plant's left hook, his left hand in general, but his left hook is probably his greatest weapon. Even though he's an orthodox fighter, his lead hand is his greatest weapon. So Caleb Plant leads the exchange with his left. Canelo counters with the right, ends up smacking the glasses into Caleb Plant's face, causing a cut under, or a scratch cut under Caleb Plant's eye. But then if you look at that clip, you look at what they were about to throw, or kind of halfway attempted to throw behind that initial strike. So what did Canelo throw after his signature right hand counter? And what did Caleb Plant throw after his signature left hand? I have more faith in Canelo's follow-up left than I do in Caleb Plant's follow-up right hand. And I think that this fight might cut along those lines. So, hand speed, who's got the advantage? I'd say it's pretty close, but I can't say that Caleb Plant has a hand speed advantage over Canelo. Maybe there are some difficulties that Canelo has early in trying to cut the ring off and try to trap and catch Caleb Plant. So I do think that Caleb Plant's going to have some success in the early rounds. I think that we could go through the first 5 or 6 rounds with the fight in question in terms of who's winning these rounds. I think that it could be like 3-2 Caleb Plant after 5, or maybe split 3-3 after 6, something like that. But even in Caleb Plant's fight against Uzcategui, you saw how he became more easy to hit in rounds 9, 10, 11, 12. He didn't have as much head movement. He didn't have as much foot movement. He was willing to hang around in the pocket a little bit longer against the guy who was the puncher, supposedly the puncher out of the two, even though it was Uzcategui who tasted the canvas twice. But Caleb Plant wasn't the same Caleb Plant in those last few rounds. And that you just cannot afford to fatigue against Canelo Alvarez. I mean, ask Sergey Kovalev, who you could argue through 8 might have been winning the fight. I thought that, through 8, maybe 9, that Kovalev might have either been in a draw or winning against Canelo Alvarez. Well, it didn't end up mattering at the end of the day. He ended up getting knocked damn near out cold against Canelo. You can't afford to fatigue. And Caleb Plant, for all the success that he might have in those early and middle rounds, I've just seen too much of Canelo now where you just, unless there's anything that diminished in Canelo that disables him from being able to fight a hard 12 rounds like he did against Gennady Golovkin twice, 12 rounds against Triple G. If this is the same Canelo that fought Callum Smith, which I get it, Caleb Plant is not Callum Smith. Better movement, doesn't hit as hard as Callum Smith by any stretch, but better movement, better sweet science boxing guy. You know, Canelo is too good at these feints, level changes, deception, decoy punches to lead you into power punches. He does too many of these things where Caleb Plant, when you look at his resume and who he's fought, I don't think that he has had the proper preparation in the ring to really match wits with Canelo Alvarez. Even if he does have the raw talent to be able to hang with Canelo, I think he's just seen too much, done too much, been through too much for Caleb Plant to be that big of a difference than anything Canelo has seen. Again, I do think that there's certain things that Caleb Plant will do well in the early and middle rounds. And he is, again, stronger than people give him credit for. He might even hurt Canelo a bit. I just think that there are too many things that Canelo's going to do in the middle to late rounds where when Caleb Plant inevitably starts slowing down, Canelo's going to start really putting it on him, and then it'll be a question of, will Caleb Plant make it the distance? I think Canelo's going to potentially have a couple 10-8 rounds. We're talking knockdowns now of Caleb Plant. I think it's very possible. I think it's also very possible that Caleb Plant receives a cut. I mean, Caleb Plant cut against Uskadagai. I believe he cut against Caleb Truax, and he cut in that press conference skirmish against Canelo Alvarez. Granted, it was under the eye and it was caused probably by the glasses, but Caleb Plant is kind of susceptible to cuts, and Canelo will cut you. He will hit you, and he will hit you hard. I mean, think about this. Canelo has the power to break Billy Joe Saunders' face in the 7th round. Caleb Plant is going to have the fight of his life to be able to beat Canelo Alvarez. I think it is possible. I think that he could win by decision. I don't see him stopping Canelo Alvarez, but he can potentially win a decision if, you know, Canelo Alvarez, for whatever reason, seems to have trouble trapping Caleb Plant and ends up looking like Mikey Garcia did against Sandor Martin, where he just looks a step behind and Caleb Plant's got these snappy punches that are rocking Canelo's head back a bit, and he looks a little too slow-footed to really close the distance, close the gap against a taller, longer, and pretty strong Caleb Plant. Sweet science guy who's able to control range. Maybe that's the case and Caleb Plant's able to pull that out. I just think that it's more likely that Canelo Alvarez really starts putting a hurting on Caleb Plant. And you know what? I was going to go Canelo Alvarez via decision, but, you know, after the press conference, and called me crazy for making a switch on that determination based on a press conference, but I do think that there is something that Caleb Plant took away psychologically from that little encounter with Canelo Alvarez. I don't think that you just come from that situation with no change in mindset or opinion or anything. I do think that Caleb Plant's going to be reacting to some of Canelo's early feints because he knows that Canelo Alvarez might be quicker than he would have imagined, probably hits harder than he would have imagined, and is a smart-ass fighter. So I do think that Caleb Plant might be a little bit spooked coming into this Canelo Alvarez fight, as tough as Caleb Plant appears to be. But I think that Canelo Alvarez is going to stop Caleb Plant. I think he's going to cut him at some point in the fight. I think he's probably going to drop him. And I don't know whether it's going to be on the stools, whether it's going to be a decision of throwing the towel, or if the ref's going to stop it after multiple knockdowns and Caleb Plant is no longer able to really defend. Look, it's kind of tough to envision this because of how well Caleb Plant has looked in every one of his fights against lesser competition. But Canelo is just so much better than anybody Caleb Plant's fought. And I do think that asking him to go 12 with Canelo is just a little tough, given these realities. So I'm actually going to go Canelo Alvarez via late round stoppage. We're talking maybe 10, 11, maybe 9. I don't think it's going to be in the final round, but I think it's going to be somewhere in that 9 to 11 range. But yeah, let me know what you think about this one in the comments. And by the way, anybody who wants to see Canelo fight, you know, Jamal Charlo or David Benavidez and thinks that he's actually ducking anybody, come on, man. Just look at the guy's resume and tell me how you could consider Canelo to be the type to duck fighters. I mean, you could make the argument that maybe he didn't fight Triple G in his absolute prime. I don't think he did. But Canelo Alvarez is obviously not afraid of the smoke. I think that when the time presents itself, I do think that he you know, if David Benavidez continues to win on his side, I think that we'll see Canelo Alvarez versus David Benavidez. We might see Canelo Alvarez versus Jamal Charlo. I think that it's more likely that we even see Canelo Alvarez start fighting some guys at 175, like Artur Beterbiev, if he's still around. I mean, he's in his mid-30s now, so I think that he's on the clock. I don't even know how he's going to do in his next fight against Marcus Brown, although you should probably still favor Beterbiev to win that. But yeah, I think we might see Canelo Alvarez versus the Dimitri Bivol, which would be another tough fight if Dimitri Bivol is as good as he's appeared to be over the past few years. But yeah, look, I've got more than a healthy amount of respect for Canelo Alvarez, his fight-by-fight schedule, and everything that he's done up to this point. And I do think that he is going to unify all 4 belts and become the undisputed champion at 168. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. Please like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.